It's good to see you back for another extraordinary turnout. Today, Professor Judith Butler will deliver the second of her Tanner lectures, The Ethics and Politics of Nonviolence. Yesterday, in her first lecture, Professor Butler posed an essential question: what leads any of us to seek to preserve the life of the other? Her question resonates with so many recent struggles to defend lives that matter, or in her words, lives that are grievable. Professor Butler led us brilliantly through the twists and turns of psychoanalytic theory via Melanie Klein's work on love, guilt, and reparation, and in the process caused us to question some of our deeply held assumptions about empathy and love. She ended her lecture with a reflection on Greek tragedy, with the lament that often follows rage. But sometimes, she added, there is a chorus, a group of anonymous people gathering and chanting in the face of rage. I'm sure I was not alone in feeling the suspense, but also on this spring day, the hope in that ending. And so I'm eager to hear Professor Butler pursue her questioning today in a different key as she moves from the inner self to the social contract, from persons and individuals to groups. After her lecture, she will be joined on stage by social and political theorist Professor Karuna Montina, who's graciously agreed to give a response to the lecture, to which Professor Butler will then respond. I remind you that we will convene in this room tomorrow morning at 10:30 for a roundtable with Yale professors Paul North and Jason Stanley. So please come back tomorrow with your questions and comments. And now please join me in welcoming Judith Butler.
Great, thank you very much. Seems like, okay, I'm mic'd, everything is okay. I'm, again, very pleased to be here, and I want to thank again the Whitney Humanities Center for its extraordinary generosity and the entire staff for making this a really pleasant and enriching time for me. I've enjoyed my conversations already with many of you, and tomorrow morning, I gather we will have more of an open question and answer period with Paul North and Jason Stanley, and I'm hoping you might still have the energy or desire to show up again so that I might learn your views. Thank you. So yesterday, I sought to engage psychoanalysis with both moral philosophy and social theory, intimating that some of our ethical and political debates make tacit demographic presuppositions about who poses the moral question and those about whom the moral question is posed. We cannot even pose the question whose lives are to be safeguarded without making some assumptions about whose lives are considered potentially grievable lives. For lives that do not count as potentially grievable stand very little chance of being safeguarded. My suggestion last time was that psychoanalysis helps us to see how phantasms can function as uncritical dimensions of our moral deliberations. And today we will pay some attention to what we might call population phantasms as a way of understanding tacit, even unconscious forms of racism that underscore some of our more deliberate reflections on violence and nonviolence. Earlier, I sought to show that moral debates on nonviolence can take two significantly different forms. The first centers on the question of the grounds for not killing or destroying another, or others in the plural, and the second on the question of what obligations we have to preserve the life of the other or others. We can ask what stops us from killing, but we can also ask what motivates us actively to find moral or political pathways that seek, where possible, to preserve life. Whether or not we pose such questions about individual others, specific groups, or all possible others matters greatly, since what we take for granted about the nature of individuals and groups, and even the ideas of humanity that we invoke in such discussions, very often demographic assumptions, including fantasies about who counts as a human, which lives are worth preserving and which lives are not, and what defines and limits our operative notions of humanity. Etymologically considered, demography is the study of the way that people, demos, are written, graphos, or represented, and though sometimes that is associated with statistics, that is only one of the graphic means by which populations are discursively elaborated. By what graphic means would we distinguish between the grievable and the ungrievable? I suggested that the category of grievable lives might be useful as we seek to elaborate an idea of the equal value of lives, and that considering the unequal distribution of grievability might be one framework for understanding the differential production of the human, of who counts as human. To claim that equality formally extends to all humans is to sidestep the fundamental question of how the human is produced. We might say that for equality to make sense as a concept, it must imply that formal extension to all humans. But even then, we make an assumption about who is included within the category of the human and who is partially included or fully excluded. For that reason, we cannot take the human as the ground of our analysis. It is a concept differentially articulated in the context of inegalitarian forms of social and political power, and because the field of the human is constituted through basic exclusions, it is haunted by the figures that do not count in its tally. In effect, I am asking how the unequal distribution of grievability enters into and distorts our deliberate ways of thinking about violence and nonviolence. One might expect that a consideration of grievability pertains only to those who are dead, but my contention is that grievability is operative in life, that it is a characteristic attributed to living creatures, marking their value within a differential scheme, and bearing directly on the question of whether or not they are treated equally and in a just way. I suggested as well that violent potential emerges as a feature of all relations of interdependency, and that a concept of the social bond that takes interdependency as a constitutive feature is one that perpetually reckons with forms of ambivalence, ones that Freud understood as emerging from the conflict between love and hate. Of course, I understand that many people will have an aversion to any discussion at all of something called the social bond, as if there were a single one. My aim is not to claim that all social relations in their historical and political diversity can be reduced to a singular sort of bond, not at all. My claim is rather that whenever we seek to consider specific historical relations, we can surely ask about the status of ambivalence in those relations, especially when those relations have involved dependency or interdependency. We may have all sorts of other reasons for thinking about social relations, but insofar as they are characterized by interdependency, it becomes possible, in my view, to ask about ambivalence and disavowal not only as features of psychic reality, but as features of social relations. And this opens up the problem of violence within that relational frame, designating that convergence that we might call the psychosocial. Of course, that does not mean that we think about violence only in that way, or even that it is the best way. As we will see, there are differences between, say, physical, legal, and institutional violence that have to be understood. My wager in these lectures is that we might gain some insight into the way that demographic assumptions pervade our debates about violence, and how this happens through certain phantasmatic operations internal to our deliberative efforts. And further, I hope to suggest that to recognize the unequal distribution of the grievability of lives can and should transform our debates about equality. Although it is possible to pose these sorts of questions in the first person, and that is often the way that moral deliberation works, It would be wrong, I think, to think that deliberating human agents are the source of all the forms of agency that produce the differential grievability of lives. In the final chapter of Foucault's 1976 lecture course, translated as Society Must Be Defended, as you know, the title is in quotation marks in English and in French, he elaborates on the emergence of the biopolitical field in the 19th century. There we find that the biopolitical describes the operation of power over humans as living beings. Distinct from sovereign power, biopolitics or biopower appears to be a distinctively European formation. It operates through various technologies and methods for managing life, but also death. For Foucault, it is a distinct kind of power inasmuch as it is exercised over humans by virtue of their status as living beings. Sometimes he calls that living status a biological status, though he does not tell us which version of biological science he has in mind at that moment. Foucault describes the biopolitical as a power to make live or to let die, but also as the power to take life or let live. As in many instances in his work, power acts, but not from a sovereign center. There are multiple agencies of power operating in a post-sovereign context to manage populations as living creatures, to manage their lives, to make them live or let them die. This form of biopower regulates, among other things, the very livability of life, determining the relative life potential of populations. This sort of power is documented in mortality and natality rates that indicate forms of racism that belong to biopolitics. And here I quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore as a perfect example. She writes, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. In other words, racism can be documented by which populations are more likely to suffer premature deaths than others. It emerges as well in the forms of pronatalism and so-called pro-life positions that regularly privilege some sorts of life or living tissue over others, such as teenage or adult women. Important for our purposes is Foucault's claim that there is no a priori right to life, that a right to life first must be established in order to be exercised. Under conditions of political sovereignty, for instance, a right to life, and even a right over one's own death, comes to exist only for those who have already been constituted as rights-bearing subjects. Under biopolitical conditions, the right to life is much more ambiguous, since power manages populations rather than distinct subjects who are subjected to sovereign power. Additionally, the relation of the biopolitical to matters of life and death is different from what he calls the relationships of war. War logics follow the dictum, and here I'm quoting him, if you want to live, you must take lives, you must be able to kill. And he writes, he doesn't write with the vous or the tu, he uses the French en, which is, of course, ambiguously singular and plural, so it's unclear whether war follows from self-preservation or group preservation. He formulates the basic maxim of war at least twice. In order to live, the other must die. In the first version, you yourself have to be prepared to kill, and killing is a means to preserve your own life. In the second version, in order to live, the other must die, but you yourself do not have to be the one who takes that life. This opens the way to other technologies and procedures by which lives can be abandoned or let to die without anyone assuming responsibility for the action. The way race enters war, or indeed the way in which state racism enters into wars, operating through biopolitical logics, is more difficult to discern in this view. Foucault has separated the biopolitical from the idea of warfare to the extent that he claims that biopower has a different relation to death. He writes that death does not swoop down, but regulates life and death through other kinds of managerial and institutional logics. The days of death swooping down are not exactly over, even if sometimes Foucault writes as if they were, to foreground another kind of power characteristic of the present. For him, power and violence are now more indirect, less spectacular, less orchestrated by state violence. Of course, he's writing in the 1970s. It's more difficult to separate sovereign power from the biopolitical, a point that he himself would make in subsequent lectures, and we should suspect any effort to establish a neat historical sequence in which the one, the biopolitical, clearly follows upon the other, the sovereign. This is especially the case if the sequence depends on a progressive version of modern European history, one that, by the way, does not take account of European wars suffered and waged during the last century. What happens if a life is considered not to be living at all? That is to say, what happens if it does not register as a life? If Foucault could claim very clearly that a right to life belongs only to a subject who is already constituted as a rights-bearing subject, one for whom life is a necessary right, can we not also then claim that the status of a living being must first be constituted for someone to become a subject with the right to life? If racism is a way of, as he put it, introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, then perhaps we can think of that break as not merely distinguishing between superior and inferior types within the idea of the species, but also between those who are considered to be living and those who are either non-living or perhaps participating in a kind of social death. After all, if a non-living population is destroyed, that is to say, a population that is considered to be non-living, is destroyed, then nothing of note has happened. There is no destruction, just a certain clearing away of an obstruction from the path of the truly living. Foucault anticipates that critics from the field of political theory will ask about his account of life. He recedes from this debate, fearing perhaps that it would commit him to a vitalism or to a foundationalist account of life that precedes contract sovereignty and the biopolitical. He writes, all this is a debate within political philosophy that we can leave on one side, he writes, but it clearly demonstrates how the problem of life came to be problematized within the field of political thought. Well, the issue cannot quite be set aside, but not because there are some assumptions about the form of life that precedes the domain of power. In my view, power is already operating through schemas of racism that persistently distinguish not only between lives that are more or less valuable, more or less grievable, but also between lives that register more or less emphatically as lives. A life can register as a life only within a schema that presents it as such. The epistemological nullification or foreclosure of the living character of a population, the very definition of a genocidal epistemology, structures the field of the living along a continuum that has concrete implications for the question, whose are the lives that are worth preserving, whose lives matter, whose lives are grievable? To ask this question is to confront from the start the particular historico-racial schema, a term prominently used by Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. It's a schema that functions as a form of perception and projection, an interpretive casing that enfolds the black body and orchestrates its social negation. In fact, Fanon distinguishes between the historic racial schema and the epidermal racial schema, which fixes an essence to black life, but it's the first of these, the historic racial schema, that seems to bear a direct relation to Merleau-Ponty's idea of a corporeal schema and to the schemas of racism that bear on the question of grievability. A corporeal schema for Merleau-Ponty is the organization of tacit and structuring bodily relations with the world, but also the operation of constituting oneself within the terms made available by that world. The historical racial schema, according to Fanon, is to be found at a deeper level, and it comes to disrupt the idealized corporeal schema proposed by Merleau-Ponty. The elements of the historic racial schema are provided by what he calls the white man, a figure for the powers of racism, that casts black bodily experience of the world into certain uncertainty. On the one hand, he writes, a third-person consciousness enters into a first-person consciousness, so one's very mode of perception is riven by another consciousness. Who is seeing when I am seeing, and when I see myself, am I seeing only through the eyes of another? On the other hand, the corporeal schema describes a way of composing oneself from the elements of the world, out of the elements of the world. Fanon describes this aspirational schema, and I quote, as a slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. The powerful figure of what he calls the white man is the one, and I quote again, who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories. So as he writes, he retells having been written or woven by the third person, and we see on the page the slow struggle of self-composition that follows upon the decomposition of the bodily schema through the working of racism. It is at the level of the bodily experience of oneself in a world where that schema is taken apart, expropriated, inhabited, occupied, and decomposed. It is at that level that this racism operates. Now, of course, Fanon uses the first and the third person, figures such as the black man and the white man, to articulate this idea of the schema. But the historic racial schema is broader and more diffuse than those particular figures. In fact, such a schema bears upon the living and embodied life of populations, and so provides a critical supplement to Foucault's reflections on anti-black racism and biopower. Such a historic racial schema precedes and informs as well policies on world health, hunger, refugees, migration, culture, occupation, and other colonial practices, police violence, incarceration, the death penalty, intermittent bombardment and destruction, war, and genocide. Although Foucault identifies state racism at the end of these lectures as one of the central instruments for the management of the life and death of populations, Foucault does not tell us precisely how racism works to establish relative values for different lives. There is, of course, a clear sense that some populations are targeted by modes of sovereign power, and that there is a letting die orchestrated by biopower, but how do we account for the differential ways in which lives and deaths matter or fail to matter? If we take racialization as the process by which a racial schema is materialized at the level of our conceptualization of what is living and what is not, then how do such basic differentials enter into military and policy debates regarding targeted populations and incarcerated peoples? And in what ways do they operate as a set of uncritically accepted presuppositions, racial schemas, in our own debates about violence and nonviolence? At the end of Society Must Be Defended, Foucault opens up the possibility that populations who are precarious or abandoned are not yet constituted as subjects of rights, and that for understanding who they are, that is to say, the way they are constituted within the political field, we need an alternative to the model of the subject. Right? The whole idea of population can't be reduced to the notion of the subject. So what language do we use? How do we describe population outside the language of the subject? In the lectures that follow, The Birth of Biopolitics, he shifts directions and focuses on neoliberalism, distinguishing between the juridical subject and the subject of interest. So he goes back to the idea of the subject. He opened a direction to think about state racism and modes of agency and resistance that emerge from populations that cannot be described as the acts of individual or as collective subjects, but then sadly that direction ended up not being the path that Foucault would take. I have a suggestion about how we might continue that abandoned project if, as Foucault has argued, under sovereign power a subject has a right to life only on the condition that the subject is constituted as a rights-bearing subject, then under conditions of biopower, a population has a claim to life on the condition that the population is registered as potentially grievable. This is my thesis, my way of offering a supplement to Foucault by bringing Fanon to bear on the question of how racial schemas enter into the racial figurations of what is living, who is living, and how racial phantasms inform the demographic valuations of who is grievable, whose lives ought to be preserved, whose can be expunged or left to die. Of course, there's a vast continuum, and populations can be grieved in one context and remain unmarked in another, and modes of grieving may be acknowledged while others are dismissed or go unrecognized. And still, the dominant schemas by which the value of life is allocated rely on a modulating of grievability, whether or not that metric is ever named. The historical racial schema that makes it possible to claim this is or was a life, or these are or were lives, is intimately bound up with the possibility of necessary modes of valuing life: memorialization, safeguarding, recognition, the preservation of life. This is a life worth living, worth preserving, and these are lives that ought to be given the condition to live and to be registered and recognized as lives. The phantasmagoria of racism is part of that racial schema that makes it impossible or difficult to make such simple claims, what should be simple claims, but are not simple claims. We can see how this works as a thought sequence crystallized in the moving images that enter into deliberative processes to negate the life claim of the person whose life is at stake, how the phantasmagoria of racism operates within the metric of grievability. It does so, for instance, in the sequence in which a person, such as James Garner, is put into a police chokehold and then audibly announces he cannot breathe and visibly can be seen not to be able to breathe, and it is registered by everyone at the scene that he will not survive the prolongation of that police chokehold, which then, after the announcement, strengthens to become a stranglehold, strangulation, murder. Does the policeman who strengthens the hold to the point of death imagine that the person about to die is actually about to attack, or that his own life is endangered? Or is it simply that this life is one that can be snuffed out because it is not considered a life, never was a life, does not fit the norm of life that belongs to the racial schema, hence it does not register as a grievable life, a life worth preserving? Or when Walter Scott in South Carolina, turning his back to the police, unarmed, clearly frightened, ran in the opposite direction from the police, how did he become phantasmagorically turned around, made into a threatening figure to be killed? Perhaps there in the moment of decision or action, we can see something that belongs to a race war logic. The policeman believes it is his life rather than the other's life that is endangered. Perhaps this is simply the violent moment of a biopolitical apparatus, a way of managing that life unto death. In this case, the black man is simply there, vulnerable to being killed, and so is killed as if he were prey and the police were hunters. So when unarmed black men or women or queer and transgender people have their backs turned to the police and are walking or running away and are still gunned down by police, an action often later defended as self-defense, even as a defense of society, how are we to understand that? Is that turning of the head or walking or running away actually construed as an aggressive advance anticipated by the police? The police person who decides to shoot or who simply finds himself shooting may or may not be deliberating, but it surely seems that a phantasm has seized upon that thought process, inverting the figures and the movement he sees to justify in advance any lethal action he may take. The violence that the police is about to do, the violence he then commits, has already moved toward him in a figure, a racialized ghost, condensing and inverting his own aggression, wielding his own aggression against himself, acting in advance of his own plans to act, legitimating and elaborating, as if in a dream, his later argument of self-defense before a court. The frame for this violence has to be, of course, expanded to forms of violence that target race and gender at once. And so to see that sometimes the violence against black women in particular takes place in different scenes, in different sequences of events, and with differing consequences. The report called Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, published in July 2015 by the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, led by Kimberly Crenshaw and Andrea Ritchie, makes clear that the main examples in the media illustrating police violence against black people in the United States nearly all involve black men, showing that the dominant frames for understanding anti-black racism and police violence operate within a restrictive gender framing. Calling for a gender-inclusive approach to racial justice, Crenshaw has independently drawn attention to the way that black women are over-policed and underprotected, but also how their injuries and deaths are not as fully documented or registered, even within the social movements explicitly focused on opposing police violence. To bring that problem into visibility, we would have to account for the various ways that black women face death in their encounters with police, whether on the street, in their homes, or in detention. There are the women stopped for traffic violations who then end up shot. Gabriela Navarez in Sacramento in 2014, or Chantel Davis in Brooklyn in 2012, or Melissa Williams in Ohio in 2012, or LaTanya Haggerty in Chicago in 1999. And then, of course, in July 2015, Sandra Bland was pulled over for failing to signal when changing lanes, charged with assault and held in jail in Waller County, Texas, only then to be found dead in her cell 3 days later. It remains unclear whether that was a suicide or a murder. Worth noting as well are the number of black women killed when police are called to intervene in domestic disputes. The police claim the women were aggressive or wielding knives, which may or may not be true, but in some instances it seems that the failure to obey a police order results in being shot. It is not always a direct killing that takes a life. A call for a doctor to help with asthma goes unanswered, and Shanek Proctor dies in a prison cell in Bessemer, Alabama in 2014. Over-policed, black women are often figured as aggressive, dangerous, out of control, or drug mules, underprotected. Their own calls for help often go unheeded or scorned, as do their calls for medical or psychiatric treatment. All of these forms of taking life or letting life go are not just concrete examples of how the metric of grievability works, determining and distributing the grievability and value of lives. These are the concrete operations of the metric itself, its technologies, its points of application. And in these instances, we see the convergence of the biopolitical logic of the historic racial schema and the phantasmagoric inversions that occlude the social bond. What may appear as an isolated act of violence or the expression of an individual psychopathology shows itself to be part of a pattern, a punctual moment within a reiterated practice of violence. That practice relies upon and consolidates a racial schema in which aggression becomes justified through a logic that draws upon the phantasmagoric inversion of aggression, that functions not only as a potential defense, but as the effective moralization of murder. A racial schema in which the living status of a black person that is already not registered within the perceptual field of the grievable is snuffed out because it did not register as a life worth preserving. The killing becomes a way of facilitating the death of those considered to be socially dead or those who should be socially dead, according to those who want them dead. But also, we might say that those who are targeted have an obstinate way of trying to continue to live, and that apparently is offensive to those who want them dead. We may conclude that a stronger and more just sense of law should be brought to bear on such instances, and I have no doubt that better law is obligatory. But to argue in that way, we have first to know what the relation is between violence and law. Should we look to law to provide an alternative to violence? We cannot readily accept the idea that violence is overcome once we make the transition from a pre-legal sociality to a legal order. As we know, there are fascist and racist legal regimes that immediately discount that view. We could say that those are instances of bad law, or we could say that those regimes are not really law and then offer a normative stipulation of what law should be through a description of what it really is. But I'm not sure that any of those particular moves, worthy as they may be, address the fundamental questions. How does the legally binding character of law require and institute coercion? And how is this form of coercion distinguishable from legal violence, if it is? Over and against the view that law establishes civil relations based on freedom and that war establishes coercive conditions for conduct, Walter Benjamin clearly identifies the coercion at the heart of legal regimes as violence. His view is taken up, or at least echoed, by Robert Cover, who was, of course, a legal scholar here at Yale, and he was primarily concerned with the act of legal interpretation as carrying its own violence. He argued, and I quote, "The relationship between legal interpretation and the infliction of pain remains operative even in the most routine of legal acts. It's perhaps most clear in the act of sentencing, a speech act with the power to imprison someone for life or even to take his or her life away. For as the judge interprets the law, and sentencing is the pronunciation of the interpretation that the judge arrives at, the judge acts to initiate and give justification for a punishment that then involves the police and prison guard who restrain, hurt, render helpless, kill, or fatally abandon the prisoner. So the Speech Act is not separate from those other acts. It's the initial moment of that violent process, and so very much a violent act. After claiming that legal interpretation is a form of bonded interpretation, Cover makes a controversial claim, and I quote, "If people disappear, if they die suddenly and without ceremony in prison, quite apart from any articulated justification and authorization for their demise, then we do not have constitutional interpretation at the heart of this deed, nor do we have the deed, the death, at the heart of the Constitution," end quote. What if the death in prison could have been prohibited and the law failed to take the necessary steps? Is there not a constitutional protection for those who die in prison to receive the assistance and resources they need to stay alive? In other words, if prison deals death not only through the death penalty, but also through more or less systematic forms of neglecting some lives rather than others, it seems that a few obligatory legal protections have surely not been honored, even those that may well engage constitutional rights. Of course, it deals death slowly and quickly, prison does. It also manages life, and so maintains life in ways that devalue life. In this sense, again, the loss of grievability characterizes the living and surely constitutes some part of unjust and unequal treatment. Cover insisted that judges are engaged in violence in their interpretive acts, including their speech acts. However much they understand themselves as conducting business at a distance from the grimmer realities of prison, they are part of the same violent system. He concluded that this violence is to be accepted and organized in ways that are justified. He proposed that, and I quote, "to do that violence safely and effectively, responsibility for the violence must be shared, and that," I quote again, "many actors must be brought into this concerted action." Fundamentally, then, he distinguishes between just and unjust violent legal regimes. Violence should not be random, and it should not be generated by only one actor, in his view. He was interested in how to think about the conduct of judges, but his views extend to how we think about violence as suffusing the legal system. We do not leave a lawless world of violence to enter into a legal world that operates without violence. Legal violence is there not only in sentencing practices, linked as they are with the practices of punishment and incarceration, but also in the binding character of the law. We are enjoined and proscribed by the law, and in doing so, the threat of legal violence is already underway, for if we fail to follow the law will lay hold of us. Cover does not easily let us make a distinction between coercion and violence, the former posited as justified, the latter as unjustifiable. On the contrary, in his view, there are only better and worse forms of legal violence. For Benjamin, too, especially in his A Critique of Violence, originally published in 1921, the binding character of law on the subject is an operation of violence. Benjamin argued prior to Cover that the relevant distinction is not between law that is coercive and crime as violence, but between legal and non-legal forms of violence. Unlike Cover, Benjamin thought that legal violence should be opposed and that challenging the binding character of the law on the subject is one way toward a broader revolutionary change. There's much to be said here, and what Benjamin ended up calling divine violence is notoriously controversial. But there's a narrower point worth considering. For Benjamin, the mistake is to consider that legal violence, precisely because it is legal, is justified, and that forms of resistance to legal regimes, precisely because they are not based on existing law, are therefore criminal or violent. In his view, a legal regime produces a framework in which justification makes sense, and actions that contest that regime are deemed violent because they do not conform to that framework. They even call that framework into question. So in a critique of violence, what one calls violence depends upon the legal constraints imposed upon justification. There is no way to name something as either violent or nonviolent without at once invoking the framework in which that designation makes sense. Now that may seem like a form of relativism. What you call violence, I do not call violence, and so on, but I want to suggest it's actually something quite different. In Benjamin's view, legal violence regularly renames its own violent character as justifiable coercion or legitimate force, but these terms sanitize the violence at issue. The renaming practice and the justification tend to be articulated through a story form that narrates the transition from pre-contractual sociability to the social contract. People come together in a pre-contractual condition, usually after some violent conflicts have come to light. In Rousseau, it's always different people wanting water from the well or deciding this is my land. And they decide that it really would be better for them on the basis of their self-interest or their common interest to impose a common set of laws upon themselves. They then enter into this founding contract or compact, freely submitting to laws, and this voluntary subjection establishes the force of the self-legislated law as a legitimate one, even an exercise of political and moral autonomy. Benjamin documents what happens to terms such as violence and nonviolence once we understand that the frameworks within which their definitions are secured are oscillating. He remarks that a legal regime that seeks to monopolize violence must call every threat or challenge to that regime a violent one. Hence, it can rename its own violence as necessary or obligatory force, justifiable coercion, and because it works through the law as the law, it is legal and hence justified. So within that framework, one that Benjamin actually calls fate, whose tautological formula is that the law is justified because it is the law, and as justified, its own violence is justified, and its own established legal framework is the one with the authority to establish frameworks of justification within which what is justified is distinguished from what is unjustified. So what he's done is to say that when we ask the question of which forms of violence are justified, we have to also ask a prior question: what is the justificatory scheme to which we refer when we start to make that decision, and is it itself produced by the legal regime that is negotiating and adjudicating the question? Now, the legal regime that's negotiating and adjudicating the question has an interest in reproducing itself and its authority, so it decides what is justifiable and non-justifiable violence, and those forms of resistance to the legal regime itself will always be understood as violent, no matter what physical form they take, precisely because they seek to delegitimate the law, its framework, and its justificatory schemes. Legitimacy, though, is, in this scenario that Benjamin gives us, derived from the tautology that the law is the law, right? The legal regime establishes the justificatory scheme that defends and sanitizes its own legal violence at the same time that it names as violent that which threatens that regime. So even to question what gives a particular regime its legitimacy, unclear whether we can ask that question in public anymore, but let's imagine we still could. What gives a particular regime its legitimacy is understood to be a violent speech act, a violent act, an act of destruction. And the reason is because all questions of legitimacy and justification can be formulated only within the framework of legal violence that is the first stipulation of legal violence. So it's not only the loss of the monopoly on violence that the legal regime counters so forcefully, and with the accusation that violence is directed against itself, but it's the very posing of the question whether or not a state and its legal apparatus are legitimate. There is actually no more violent thing one can do from the perspective of the legal regime that he's describing And yet, it seems to me that this is a basic act of critical inquiry, or basic act of posing the question of justification. The attribution of violence under such conditions and by such authorities thus establishes any act, even the posing of a question about violence, that is not already within the obligatory framework established by and for legal violence, as itself violent. Okay. At this point, we can see how something called critique, I kind of remember that term, there's something called critique, in Benjamin's view, which queries the production and self-validation of schemes of justification, can easily be called violence. Indeed, for Benjamin, any inquiry, any statement, any action that calls into question the framework of legal violence within which the justificatory scheme is established will itself be called violent, and the opposition to such a fundamental form of querying, of asking the question, will be understood as a legal effort to contain and quash a threat to the rule of law. On the one hand, Benjamin offers us a way to debunk a spurious charge that a critical relation to a legal regime is by definition a violent one, even when it pursues nonviolent means. On the other hand, the position of critique, the one that does not accept the justificatory schemes established within and by the legal framework, is what he associates with what he calls divine violence, pure power over all life for the sake of the living, a power distinct from law, and that seems to have as its main aim the deconstitution of a legal regime. Oddly, divine violence includes forms of adamant non-action, like refusing to participate, strikes, failing to show up for work, refusing to take food, refusing to reproduce oneself as a subject in prison, refusing to reproduce oneself as a subject bound by law. Whatever divine violence may be, and I cannot enter into this domain here, because we would be here for several weeks, we never seem to be offered a definitive example, and he's very clear that there is no definitive example of divine violence. It hovers about the example. There seems to be a kind of interdiction on the image that defines divine violence. The only thing we really know about it is that it's not state violence, and that its aim is to deconstitute legal violence. If we follow Benjamin's analysis, we cannot quite start with a definition of violence and then proceed to debate under what conditions violence is justified or not. That is to make use of the very justificatory scheme about which we have to think historically and critically. The reason we cannot start that way is that violence is from the start defined within certain frameworks and comes to us always already interpreted or worked over by its frame. The historicity of that working over is congealed in the discursive framework within which violence appears, and that tends to be one in which legal violence, and we might add institutional or administrative forms of violence, are generally occluded. If one refuses to answer the question of which sorts of violence are justified and which are not, because one wants to call attention to the limited justificatory schemes that frame the question, then one risks a certain unintelligibility. One is told one is not practical. Or one comes to seem dangerous or as a kind of threat or as a nihilist. So on the one hand, as we can see, radical critical inquiry into the legitimating grounds for a legal order, one that operates through legal violence, can be called violent acts, but that accusation works to suppress critical thought and ultimately serves the purposes of legitimating existing law. Is violence here the name given to those efforts to undermine and destroy prevailing institutions of legal violence? If so, it does not exactly serve to describe a set of actions, but to enforce evaluation upon them. And it does not much matter whether or not violence functions as a good description for whatever inquiry, action, or inaction is at issue. Whatever is called violence within this scene becomes regarded as violent from a particular perspective embedded in a defining framework. We might first presume that violence is physical, but if we do that, we fail to account for those kinds of violence that are linguistic, emotional, institutional, and economic, that undermine and expose life to harm or death, but do not take the literal form of a blow. If irrigation systems are destroyed, or if populations are abandoned to disease, are these not rightly understood as operations of violence? What about chokeholds and forcible detention, solitary confinement? The figure of the physical blow cannot describe the full spectrum of violence, and no one figure can. We could begin to construct typologies, as many people have, but the lines between types of violence tend to blur. My point here is that violence is always interpreted within a framework so that we cannot always agree on what constitutes its empirical instance. There are ways of renaming and failing to name the very same act that plague the moral and legal debates on violence. That does not mean that violence can be wished away or that it's a matter of subjective opinion. On the contrary, violence is precisely what is perpetually subjected to an oscillation of frameworks, and one can see how this works in Talal Asad's important analysis of death dealing. Some forms of death dealing are justified, glorified, others are disparaged and condemned. Depending on the state, state-sanctioned violence is justified, non-state-based violence is unjustified. Indeed, with the support of some versions of the state, the death dealing is said to be done in the name of justice and democracy, and in non-state-based violence, the death dealing is criminal or terrorist. Well, sometimes it is. But the methods may be similar or different, and their destructive power may be equal or equally horrific. And yet the fact that life is taken away in brutal forms within each framework does not always lead to the insight that there is a greater proximity among forms of death dealing than we might be led to expect. One might well consider established nonviolent tactics of resistance to legal or economic forms of exploitation or political forms of constraint, such as the strike, the hunger strike in prison, work stoppages, nonviolent forms of occupying government or official buildings or spaces, or those whose private and public status is being contested, or boycotts of various kinds, including consumer and cultural boycotts, sanctions, but also public assemblies, petitions, ways of refusing to recognize illegitimate authority or declining to vacate institutions that have illegitimately been closed. What tends to unify such actions or inactions, depending on your point of view, is that they all call into question the legitimacy of a set of policies or actions, or even, in the case of the general strike, the legitimacy of a specific form of rule. And yet all of them, by virtue of calling for a change in police, state formation, or rule, can be called destructive, since they do ask for a substantial alteration of the status quo, and they raise the question of legitimacy that becomes regarded as a violent act. When violence comes to name nonviolent forms of resistance to legal violence, then it becomes all the more important to situate that naming practice critically within political frameworks and their self-justificatory schemes. I see this not only as a task for contemporary critical theory, but for any self-reflective ethics and politics of nonviolence. While I take seriously Benjamin's claim that we have to think critically about how such justificatory schemes are established before we simply start operating within them, I also think that we are obligated to make decisions that commit us to certain frameworks. As much as we cannot decide whether or not violence is justified without knowing what counts as violent, we cannot give up on the demand to decide in the face of this problem. In other words, the operation of critique cannot preclude both commitment and judgment. Benjamin casts light on the question of whether any given action should be considered violent or nonviolent. The frame within which the question is posed determines in large part the way it is settled. The justificatory schemes produced by the law tend to reproduce its own legitimacy precisely in the way that settles that question. In the brief time remaining, I hope to take up a related question, namely, how we understand principled arguments in favor of nonviolence that tend to make exceptions for self-defense. And I think we see one form of self-defense operates in the police justification for the killing of unarmed black men or black people more generally. But I think we can also see states who use self-defense as a way of legitimating their own military aggression. And yet self-defense seems to be an important term, and it's one to which many of us seek recourse when we try to explain our own views on nonviolence. So one question I have is how do we understand principled arguments in favor of nonviolence that tend to make exceptions for self-defense? Is it possible to have an ethics and politics of nonviolence that does not make an exception for self-defense? Is the term self-defense yet another way of framing violence such that its justifiable character comes to the fore? Some would argue that only force is used in the name of self-defense, but not violence. Can we hold to a stable distinction between force and violence? If self-defense constitutes an exception to the prohibition on violence, how are we to understand that exception? Through what discursive logic does it work? Does one have to have a particular kind of self, a valorized self, in order to be entitled to defend that self? Are there, for instance, defensible and indefensible selves? Moral philosophers and theologians have asked what grounds the claim that the interdiction against killing is wrong. The usual way of handling this question is to ask whether that interdiction, commandment, or prohibition is absolute, whether it has a theological or other conventional status, whether it is a matter of law or morality. It's invariably accompanied by a further question, namely whether there are bona fide exceptions to such an interdiction when injuring or even killing is justified. And then debates tend to ensue about what, if any, exceptions exist and what they indicate about the less than absolute character of that interdiction. Self-defense usually enters the debate at this juncture. The exception to the rule is important, perhaps more important than the rule itself. For instance, if there are exceptions to the prohibition on killing, and if there are always such exceptions, this suggests that the prohibition on killing is less than absolute. It's a prohibition that on occasion fails to assert itself, or holds itself back, or suspends its own powers of restraint. Self-defense is, of course, a highly ambiguous term, as we can see in militaristic modes of foreign policy that justify attacks as self-defense, and in contemporary U.S. law, the stand your ground provisions that make provisions for preemptive killing. It can, and in practice, and does extend to the defense of loved ones, children or animals, or others who are considered close to you, relations that are part of one's broader sense of self. It therefore makes sense to ask what defines and limits those relations, what elaborates the conception of the self to include groups of others in this way, and why are they usually understood as biological relatives or those related through conjugal ties. And I'm aware that in discussions I have with friends and colleagues about nonviolence, I can ask the question, do you have a principled opposition to violence? And usually in my neighborhood they say yes. And then, but they say, but with an exception. And then the question is, but of course if someone attacked my child, I would hurt that person, I would even kill that person. And I said, well, what about your sister? Yeah, I would do that for my sister too. And your Uncle Elmer, how do you feel about him? Well, he didn't give me a present last Hanukkah, right? So, and then, the sister-in-law, well, she lives in Tennessee and I never see her. In other words, there's a kind of moment, right, where one decides, like, whose life you would be willing to kill to preserve, and whose life you just maybe they'll have to find another way. In any case, I think it's important. Why? Because an arbitrary and dubious distinction emerges between those who are close to one, in the name of whose protection one may commit violence, even murder, and those who are at a distance from oneself, in the name of whom, in whose defense, one may not kill. So what and who is part of the self that you are, and what relations are included under the rubric of the self to be defended? I would defend myself if attacked, and I would defend this one who's close to me and this one who's close to me, because they are part of my selfhood, my extended idea of selfhood, the kin relations or the close relations that are part of who I am intimately. If I defend myself and those who are considered part of myself or proximate enough so that I know and love them, then this self that I am is related to these others, yes, but the relations that belong to this self as I define it are limited to those who are proximate and similar. So one is justified in using violence to defend those who defend the lives of those who belong to that region of the self. I almost wrote regime of the self. Some group is then covered by my expanded claims of self-defense, and they're understood to be worthy of a violent protection against violence, of violence done to others so that it's not done to one's own. The interdiction against violence reemerges within the exception. Now it is that group composed of those who are not part of my region of the self, who threaten my group with violence, and against those I'm apparently justified in waging violence. The interdiction now is imposed on the other group, the one that is not my own, not to engage in violent acts. Absent that operative interdiction, I or we are apparently justified in killing. When we get to that point in which one's group violently defends what it takes to be itself against violence, not only is a rather large and consequential exception made to the interdiction against violence, but the distinction between the force of the interdiction and the violence interdicted starts to collapse. The exception to the interdiction opens up onto a situation of war in which it is always right to defend oneself or one's own, those who are close to you, violently and in the name of an expanded self-defense, but certainly not a whole host of others who do not belong to oneself. And this means that there will always be those whose lives I do not defend, and there will always be those who seek to do violence to those whose lives are intricately bound up with my own, part of my extended region of the self. At such moments, the interdiction against violence proves to be less than absolute. To be sure, the exception to the interdiction becomes a potential state of war, or at least coextensive with war logic. Since if one will kill for this or that person who is proximate and affiliated, what finally distinguishes the proximate from the non-proximate, and under what conditions could that distinction be regarded as ethically justifiable? Of course, international human rights interventionists, what we used to call liberal hawks in the United States, would argue that, what follows from what you're saying is that we in the first world should be prepared to go to war for everyone. But my point is decidedly different. The exceptions to the norm of nonviolence actually begin to elaborate forms of group identification, even nationalism or racism, that result in a certain war logic. It goes like this. I am willing to defend those who are like me, and only those who are like me, or who might be understood as part of the generalized regime of this self that I am, but not those who are unlike me, which converts rather easily into the claim, I will defend only those who are like me, recognizable to me, but will defend against those who are not recognizable to me, and with whom no ties of belonging seem to exist. Or I will abandon that population, right? They're either the attacker, against which I have to defend myself, or they're the ones who are left to be attacked or let to die. With these examples, one question I'm trying to pose is whether there's a norm that is invoked to distinguish those who belong to the group whose lives are worth saving and those who do not belong to that group and whose lives are not worth saving or defending. For implicit in the way the exception to the interdiction against violence works is that there are those who are understood to belong and to deserve protection against violence, whereas those who do not belong, well, in relation to them, I invoke my principle of nonviolence and I do not intervene on their behalf. Now, that may sound like a cynical way of putting things, but it's meant only to foreground the fact that some of our moral principles may well be already in the sway of other political interests and frameworks. The distinction between populations that are worth violently defending and those who are not implies that some lives are simply considered more valuable than others. So my suggestion has been to consider that the principle by which conditions under which the exception to nonviolence are identified is at once a measure for distinguishing among populations, those one is ready to grieve or do not qualify as grievable, those one is prepared to grieve if something terrible were to happen and whose death ought in all instances to be forestalled, those one is not prepared to grieve, who do not live out a potentially grievable life and whose loss would not make a mark. So if we make exceptions to the principle of nonviolence, it shows that we're ready to fight, to harm, even to murder, that we're prepared to give moral reasons for doing so. And according to this logic, one does this either in self-defense or in defense of those who belong to this proximate regime of the self, with whom identification is possible, or who are recognized to constitute the broader social or political domain of selves to which one's own self belongs. And if that last proposition is true, that is, there are those I'm willing to hurt or murder in the name of those with whom I share a social identity or love or identify with in some way that is essential to who I am, then there is a moral justification for violence that emerges precisely on a demographic basis. So what's demography doing in the midst of a moral debate about exceptions to the interdiction against violence? Well, I've been suggesting simply that what starts as a moral framework for understanding nonviolence turns into a different kind of problem, a political problem. In the first instance, the norm we invoke to distinguish lives we're willing to defend and those that are effectively dispensable is part of a larger operation of biopower that unjustifiably distinguishes between grievable and ungrievable lives. But if we accept the notion that all lives are equally grievable and that the political world ought rightly to be organized in such a way that this principle is affirmed by economic and institutional life, then we arrive at a different conclusion and perhaps at another way to approach the problem of nonviolence. After all, if a life from the start is regarded as grievable, then every precaution will be taken to preserve and safeguard that life against harm and destruction. In other words, what we might call the radical equality of the grievable is what we have to understand as the demographic precondition for an ethics of nonviolence that does not make the exception. I'm not saying that no one should defend oneself or that there are no cases where intervention is necessary, but rather than take up those hard cases individually, I would like merely to suggest that a thoroughly egalitarian approach to the preservation of life imports a perspective of radical democracy into the ethical consideration of how best to practice nonviolence. There's no difference between lives worth preserving and lives that are potentially grievable, which means that grievability governs the way in which living creatures are managed and proves to be an integral dimension of biopolitics, but also to our ways of thinking about equality among the living. My further claim is that this argument in favor of equality bears directly on the ethics and politics of nonviolence. A nonviolent practice may well include a prohibition against killing, but cannot be reducible to that prohibition. For instance, the response to a pro-life position, so-called pro-life position, is to argue first for the equal value of life and to show that the pro-life position is actually committed to gender inequality, generating a subject with the right to life while decimating the claims that women make to their own lives. Right? So the problem with it is not so much about deciding when and where life begins. The problem with it is that it is based on a principle of inequality. I understand that this leaves many questions unanswered, including the important question of whether we're referring only to human life, to cell tissue, embryonic life, or to all species and to living processes, including the ecological conditions of life itself. My point would be to rethink the relationality of life regularly covered over by typologies that distinguish forms of life. By relationality, I would include concepts of interdependency and not only those among living human creatures. For instance, human creatures living somewhere requiring soil and water for the continuation of life are also living in a world of non-human creatures whose claim to life clearly overlaps with the human one, and where each are also sometimes quite dependent on one another for life as well. Those overlapping zones of life, or the living, have to be thought as both relational and processual, but also, each of them, as requiring conditions for the safeguarding of life. Interdependency always raises that question of destructiveness that is a potential part of any living relation, and yet the social organization of violence and abandonment, crossing the sovereign and biopolitical operations of power, constitute the contemporary horizon in which we have to reflect upon the practice of nonviolence. If the practice remains restricted to an individual mode of life or decision-making, we lose sight of that interdependency that produces the framework of equality as well as the risk of destructiveness. As a result, the ethical and political practice of nonviolence requires an opposition to biopolitical forms of racism and war logics that rely on phantasmagoric inversions that occlude the binding and interdependent character of social life. It requires as well an account of why and under what conditions the frameworks for understanding violence and nonviolence, or violence and self-defense, seem to invert into one another, causing confusion about how best to pin down those terms. The practice of nonviolence has to confront all these challenges, and that can become a matter of despair. Right now, in Turkey, for instance, those who have signed a petition for peace are accused of terrorism. And in Palestine, those who seek a political form that guarantees equality and political self-determination are accused of destructiveness. Such allegations are meant to paralyze and undermine the advocate of nonviolence and to distort the position against war, to distort anti-war positions as if they were nothing but a position within war. Now, when that happens, an anti-war position is taken to be a warring position. The critique of war is construed as subterfuge, aggression, or dissimulated hostility. But why? Is it because no position can be imagined outside the frame of war? And that all positions, however nonviolent, emphatically nonviolent, are always and only permutations of violence? Here we see the paranoid logic returns. Perhaps as well, a form of critical patience is required in which the phantasmagoria that deny our mutual dependency are given a chance to deflate and scatter. It is not easy to refuse the phantasmagoric formulation that imagines that someone is attacking when they are not, or that someone is destroying when they are calling for peace. A phantasm has substituted for whoever is speaking and acting at that moment, and those who fear them encounter destruction in this externalized figure. That form of defensive aggression is quite far from the insight that this life is not finally separable from another life, no matter what walls are built between them. With this last perspective, we might reapproach equality and cohabitation in new terms, starting from the presumption that all lives are equally grievable, and to see how that matters both in life and in death. For in life, the potentially grievable life is one that deserves a future, and it is one that belongs to those who seek to safeguard that future and, when necessary, mourn that life. Such an affirmation would prove to be quite different from self-preservation at the expense of others, fortified by figures of aggression that project the destructive potential in every social bond in ways that break the social bond itself. It's precisely because we can destroy that we are under an obligation to know why we ought not to do it. Nonviolence becomes a moral norm by which we are bound, against which we rail, and that it is our obligation to preserve. It establishes the vexed social form of our lives. It leads us to ask whether self-preservation is not linked to preserving the lives of others, and whether it has any meaning, self-preservation, without being linked to a commitment to preserve the lives of others. If self-preservation were the exception to principles of nonviolence, then who would that self be who preserves itself, and only those who belong already to the regime of that self? Such a self stands worldless, and it threatens this world. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Nope, I think I sit over here.
See if this is working. Okay, I think so.
Okay.
People a chance. Well, thank you so much. It's of course a privilege to be able to engage in this conversation. And one of the things I think that's especially striking in this lecture is, in this lecture in particular, is how you force us to, I think, confront how starkly our moral imagination, our ethical intuitions have been, are perpetually threatened or deformed by living in the shadow of perpetual war. I mean, quite literally, I think, we've all been living here in a country that has been at war for 15 years. Our students, mostly the entirety of their thinking lives. And it's a war that, as we've seen, has issued into an era of ultranationalism in some places, these extraordinary defenses of state power and violence, and expanding apparatuses of punitive military domains. And so I think there is some wonder, it's a very striking and wonderful way that in your work you bring together this background of war and the processes it unleashes that links, for example, Black Lives Matter to the refugee crisis and the conceptual question at the heart of today's talk, that there is something about this backdrop that leads us to see or confronts us with the fact that there are radically inegalitarian ways that we mourn victims of political violence, even as we know when the perpetrators might be allegedly the same. So ISIS bombings in Europe versus Turkey or Yemen or Tunisia generate very different media responses, very different affective positionings. But the question I want to pose, or maybe it's more of a comment because I think I agree or in allegiance with so much of what you said, is really from the viewpoint of how to think about nonviolence today, the question and the demands, the possibilities of reviving a politics and ethics of nonviolence. It seems that the questions that nonviolence, thinking about nonviolence today demands are two that you really circle around. One is trying to understand why we support or give succor or somehow can't find the language to resist or critique violence. And then another about what is it that we can do to restrain those impulses, those drives, those temptations. And so in this sense, the question, and that is something, that ability to constrain or constrain those drives are a part of the core of what the ethics and politics of nonviolence are, I take it to be. And so my question, I'll circle around, will be really about ultimately how to connect the ethos or ethics to the politics of nonviolence. And I'll start with this wonderful example of self-defense that you, and I think it was, to me, a wonderful undoing of the moral philosophic demand for justification about killing. And as you say, self-defense is often taken as this universally accepted moral maxim. I mean, we know in political philosophy, early modern political thought, natural rights theories, it's taken self-preservation is considered a kind of universal because it's considered minimal. It's everyone around the world could agree to it. But what you show very clearly is that it's neither very simple nor very minimal. In the end, it's the definition of the self is a problem. And I would say, just as an addition, the problem is what you say. It's partially because it produces an us and an them, but in another way, it seems to be even more dangerous because it actually necessarily bleeds outward. It expands. The I is always becoming the we in the self. The self is our state, our people, our values, our co-religionists, our civilization. And it might even be the most dangerous when the we that we speak for is completely abstract. So the humanitarian interventionist or the liberal hawk might be the most dangerous of being unrestrained in that expansion from the I to the we. And here I think that, to me, it raises this deep moral psychological question about the deformation that happens when I becomes we. And the deformation to me is not about us and them as much as the loss of a constraint, against violence. I mean, it's exactly the expansionist tendency. And here I think both, as you note, Freud, this was what Freud I think had in mind when he says when individuals meld with groups, they become morally uneducable. I think that's your language. And I think Reinhold Niebuhr has a very similar language that when individuals meld in this way to groups, they become, it's unrestrained egoism, because there's a kind of altruistic base to that egoism. So I think, but here I also want to say that I think what's important about the question of justification is, in a way, again, to think how perverse of a demand it is to give a justification for killing. And as you say, theorists of nonviolence are always asked, when would you justify killing? But I think it is important to recognize that Gandhi, Martin Luther King, the leading thinkers and practitioners, I think neither of them took the question very seriously for precisely that reason, that it leads you to the wrong place to ask it. And I think Martin Luther King rarely writes, but Gandhi does respond, but he, I think, like you, questions who the self is in that question of self-defense. But I think it raises a larger question about what nonviolence meant for Gandhi and MLK if it didn't stem from or rely on a moral justification of non-killing, we might say, or the interdiction against killing. And here I think I would ask and push the question that maybe it's not the right place to begin, that nonviolence for them and maybe for us isn't really primarily about moral philosophy as understood in this apparatus of justification, but a practical political orientation. So not an ethic maybe even, and maybe not even an ethos, but something about a distinctive form of political action, doing politics in a certain way, aiming for a certain kind of result. So that's sort of one way I want to pose it. How do we connect the ethics to this practical way of doing politics? And here I think, so I'll just say the second point is really, I think what's really exciting is I like the idea of moving away from moral justification and back to moral psychology. And here I think that to me captures something very close to the impetus for nonviolence. Is, you know, what's important for nonviolence is not figuring out what makes killing wrong or having a coherent philosophic case about it, but how do we avoid, restrain, counter the impulse, the drive, the temptation of political violence? And it seemed like to me, and it's specifically what kind of action can we perform that enables, produces, sustains the psychic dispositions that can correct this or mitigate, or this is the question you asked yesterday, that drives temptations toward violence. So to me it resonated with, to me, what I took you to be saying yesterday about a definition of nonviolence as, in your terms, an anticipatory care to preempt the damage we might cause, or a safeguarding against the destruction of which we ourselves are capable. And so I think there too, the we is so powerful because it's about turning back to ourselves to think about those, to constrain those drives that lead to expansion beyond the self in some form. And so here I would just say, so again, for nonviolence, I think it is important, as you show us in both lectures, that we have to think through very carefully, what is this source of impulse towards destruction? And that wonderful reading you gave of Klein as a way to think about the destructive potential that inheres in any social bond, about how it's given by our attempt to resist a dependence and independence, or a struggle against dependence. And here I thought, to me, the analogous model for maybe a more political model to me would be the kind of account of the struggle with dependence that we might have in our experience of politics and political action itself. So here I would place Gandhi and nonviolence in a dialogue with thinkers like Arendt, Weber, who drew attention to, and you know, in a way, the background of Greek thinkers, the attention to the fragility and tragedy of action itself, that there is radical contingency or even unmasterability in politics, in political action. And it's a realm in which there's always, where fate or the meaning or implication of your action is beyond your control. It's a realm of interaction, maybe even beyond your knowledge. So Weber would call it unintended consequences. Arendt will call it contingency of some kind, or unmasterability. We can't control other people's responses to our actions. And psychically, and I think Arendt uses that language, and I think both Arendt and Weber see that we psychically feel this as an unbearable burden, a radical dependence on others, a loss of control, a lack of self-sufficiency, a loss of mastery. So it seems to me very analogous to the psychoanalytic question, but here the burden of action is, the problem is, again, the moral psychological response to this burden of action is a temptation towards mastery of other people's actions, towards force, and a fantasy of force in some form too. And I think that is something powerful to reckon with, that it's extraordinary how common and recurring it is to justify violence by a kind of hyper-realist fantasy that somehow violence can produce predictable results or produce deference. And it seems that to me is the key, as you mentioned, both in the Sandra Bland example as well as the Turkey. That why do these victims appear as threats? And in some ways, it feels that what they've done is not threat, but they have they have not responded with what people, the expectation of deference to images of power. And so so the struggle becomes this continual attempt to demonstrate power, but it's partially the fact that violence is futile. And so there's a constant need to try to exemplify it in all these terrible actions. So to me, I think the idea of an anticipatory or preemptive safeguard against this destructive temptation towards using violence or displays of violence is what I think it captures something very important about what nonviolent action was meant to do. But I think the challenge maybe, and I think moral psychology is again a key move that can make that link between ethics and politics, but I think the challenge maybe is, for me, is to still to think about how to translate that set of psychic dispositions that we may admire or want to cultivate into precise forms of action. And I mean it, and I think I'm actually hopeful about it, because I think it's precisely the same challenge that Gandhi and King faced, and the history of nonviolence is really, in its most creative form, is about inaugurating creative forms of protest that can embody those forms of constraint and work against that temptation. So I think it's to me the challenge, and maybe something in the background of the despair that we have a history to turn to. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, how do I start? Well, first of all, those are wonderful, helpful and provocative questions, and I'll try to do my best to begin to respond. I do think that part of what I'm moving towards is a view that we can't pose and answer the question of nonviolence or violence all by itself, as if it is an abstract one, and as if it's one that that we each individually have to confront. I think we do at some level, but I think the way that has to happen is by entering into a political reflection on more profound questions of inequality that pertain to living creatures, and who lives and who doesn't, or who is registered as living and who's not, or who's grievable in the ways that I tried to describe. And so I want that ethical problem and that moral deliberation to be resituated within a political theory of equality, and for us to be able to rethink equality to include the unequal distribution of the grievable, because I do think those demographic distinctions inform our moral reasoning, and in fact inform many popular forms of self-defense or of offering exceptions to the principle of nonviolence. I don't think nonviolence should be a principled position, actually. I think it's an ethos, it's a practice, and it belongs to a broader politics, which means that it is constantly having to sacrifice the first person point of view at the same time that we can't fully vacate the first person point of view. So it has to decenter the I at the same time that it has to return there in some way. That might take longer to explain. I appreciate what you have to say about the so-called dangers of group behavior. I always stay away from that part of Freud. Interestingly, I'm made nervous by it. I know that there's something right, mass psychology and all the rest, but I think he's so nasty about groups that he that he can't understand what they can be, or what their forms of resistance might be, or what their forms of action might be when it's distributed agency, or when it's concerted action, even in the Arendtian sense. And I worry that we lose, when the I moves to the we and becomes group action on the model of mass psychology and Freud, we become dangerous, we become fascist, we become melded, we lose our minds, we're given over to horrible passions and the rest. But I think, in fact, there has to be a way in which the I moves to the we and inhabits the complicated way that the I is implicated in the we. So, for instance, if we think about feminist self-defense, and of course that's a very strong question for me, and I actually took feminist self-defense down the road here many years ago. But one of the interesting things about feminist self-defense is that you never take a feminist self-defense class alone, right? I mean, you might have a tutor, but it would be odd because you are part of a community that learns practices together, and you undergo all kinds of exercises and scenarios, and you learn gestures and movements and how to move and how to fall and how to run and how to block, and but you learn these things together, and it seems like the solidarity of that moment is really crucial to the individual action. In other words, it is an individual act, but it's also a moment of solidarity, so that even when you're on the street and you're having to practice it, you are in some sense accompanied even when you're not accompanied. It's still a social practice, or it's a collective kind of practice that is learned at the individual level and very often used at the individual level, but there's both an I and a we there. I mean, it's feminist. It's not just my personal individual self-defense, and I am acting in my own defense if I consider myself a woman. Some days that happens. But so with other women as well, right? So there's some kind of solidaristic dimension to that action, no matter how isolated it might be. So I don't want like a pure merging of the I and the we, but I want that interdependency to be there so that we move from the first person to the we to the social more broadly, which also includes a they, or a question of how we even decide the we and the they, so that is also brought to the fore. And I'm not sure we can answer questions about violence and nonviolence without doing that. The French philosopher Elsa Dorlin has also written extensively about self-defense and how the concept of self-defense in Western political theory made some very, very strong claims about who could be a self, who could claim self-defense, right? Other kinds of aggressive actions done by those who are not considered to have a bona fide self become just aggressive and unjustifiable and signs of barbarism. So there is, I think, a very interesting problem there. Maybe we could talk about Gandhi for a moment, and even King's relationship to Gandhi, because that's certainly, I have that written in another part of this project. And here, I guess I want to think a little bit about it. It seems to me that Gandhi does make the claim very, very strongly that political positions have to be grounded in a moral philosophy or in a moral position. And morality is not codified by law, and it's not codified by the state, and it could never be fully reducible to politics. It has to guide politics, and it has to elaborate a set of criteria and a set of norms by which we then enter into politics, or perhaps even leave politics. I appreciate that very much. It's a very, very strong defense of the sphere of morality. But I also worry that for him, there are a number of presumptions that are made about who is capable of that morality. In other words, what kind of education do you need to have in order to be able to reflect morally in the way that he believes we ought to be able to reflect? And he has some pretty strong social hierarchies in his views, and has some pretty nasty things to say about the untouchables, but also has some complicated gender dimensions of that work, right? So he ends up opposing passive forms of nonviolence because they're feminine, and he wants active forms that are more appropriately masculine and even more potentially heroic. So I don't don't know. I'm just still working with that. Oddly enough, I was recently in Memphis and went to an exhibition, actually it was a couple of years ago, where one saw how Martin Luther King's group had republished Gandhi's principles on nonviolence in an abridged form and handed it out throughout the South to people who were combating segregation and racism. And there was, of course, an enormous debate there about whether Gandhi was going to lead people, black people who were opposing racism in the South and segregation in particular, to handle humiliating actions, like to sit there at the counter where blacks were not allowed and to have food thrown at them without fighting back. Right, so you handle a terrible humiliation like that, and you don't get up and punch the guy out. You allow yourself to be taken from the room and even filmed in that way. And of course, Malcolm X couldn't stand that and thought that, in fact, Gandhi was effeminizing the civil rights movement. So Gandhi had his own critique of the effeminizing form of nonviolence, and then he was subject to that very accusation. So there's something kind of interesting in that. And problematic, but I do think that probably there is something to be said about thinking about morality and moral psychology in particular, as you suggest, in order to get a better grasp on what the practice of nonviolence is. So if we move from, say, a principled position on nonviolence to a practice of nonviolence. And that's where I think Freud is interesting, not just in showing us about dependency, and Klein really does that, but the idea of unmanageable dependency and unacceptable proximity, right? I have to live next to this person. I have to be on the bus with this person. I have to see this person in the morning. I don't have any choice about it. It's unwilled proximity, and it's unwilled dependency, right? And that is a feature of life for many people who live in multiracial, multicultural, multinational, multi-religious environments who don't necessarily want to be up against somebody they haven't chosen to live with, but they are. They're up against them all the time. So they're, that I think there's some way to link rage with unthinkable, unmanageable, unacceptable forms of proximity and dependency. And of course, psychoanalysis allows us to see that as is infantile dependency, but it's not as if we grow up and become radically independent. I mean, it just seems that those forms, those responses to dependency are take other forms and other modalities, but I think we are all at risk of feeling absolute rage about unmanageable dependencies, whether it's in a workplace or the police or healthcare or whatever it might be. So I think that maybe there's some way to work with unwilled proximity and unmanageable interdependency. I mean, my favorite recent political debate was with a wonderful guy who shall remain nameless, but he writes for Haaretz, and he said, we're so angry, he's Israeli, he said, we're so angry, we're going to divorce the Palestinians. I think we're just going to divorce them. I said, well, I didn't know it was a marriage. He says, no, well, you don't understand. We're just going to say no, we're going to have nothing to do with them. I said, so how's that going to work with the border? I said, you're going to be building your border, you're going to be fortifying your border, you're going to be policing your border. You're going to be policing your border every day, every minute, all day long, all night long. In other words, you have a permanent relationship to those who you have decided you have divorced. You have a permanent relationship to those you have divorced. Many of you have permanent relationships to people you have divorced. It's not the end of the relationship. It's just like, oh, in another modality, right? Okay, I'm just saying. But it's like no, there's an interdependency there. There's no way not. And plus, the 20% of Israel is Palestinian. It's like, do we forget that demographic? And do we look at the Well, I don't know what they're going to do about the settlers if they make the divorce. That would be interesting. In any case, the unthinkability of living together under conditions of unmanageable interdependency or unwilled proximity. And I think there's something there that is the impetus for violence, the challenge to nonviolence. What does it mean to live through that unwilled situation as your obligation? I actually felt there was, for all her faults, I do feel like Hannah Arendt understood that was the obligation of cohabitation in the modern world, even though she wasn't able to elaborate those principles in relationship to U.S. racism in the ways that we hope she would have. Okay. What else do I want to respond to here? There's so much. Maybe, I think it's a question of what's a psychic disposition and what's a feature of a social relationship, and whether we can say what is moral psychology and what is a social relationship. And as much as I'm very interested in the drive theory and even in Freud's late reflections on the death drive, I think some ways of describing that destructiveness actually presume that it emerges from relationships rather than from some internal instinctual core. And of course, the word drive, which is in German, it's Trieb, which is just push. You know, it's like you're pushed. You're pushed in this way, you're pushed in that way, which is non-predictable, which way you will actually go. And let's get back to violence and predictability. It's translated by Strachey as instinct, and Freud does use instinct about 5 times, maybe 12. But in fact, drive is much more often the case, and it's not a biologistic category. It's what he calls a threshold concept. He even says it's between the somatic and the ideational. That it's a threshold concept. And I think that maybe if we think about the drive in that way, we see that it's not a causal propulsion of some kind, and it's not necessarily part of a biological constitution, although biology comes into play, surely, in relationship to fantasy, ideation, social and cultural factors. It's an interactive kind of moment or a threshold moment of some kind. But it allows us, I think, to ask more generally about what this body is in its dependency and even in its dependency for its biological persistence. There's no way to separate the question of biological persistence from dependency on social institutions more broadly. They're always there in the negotiation of dependency. And so I think ambivalence and questions of hatred and rage also emerge partly by virtue of the fact that what is required is also what does. The dependency that is invariably the case is in tension with ideas of mastery or omniscience or full agency. But of course, the question is whether when we lament the loss of mastery we have, it's not just that we're diminished or that we're made smaller than we think, but that we're actually exposed to that domain of unmanageable dependency, which is a kind of deconstitution of the inflated ego. I really appreciated your remarks about state. I think you're mainly about state violence, really, about what state violence is doing when it cracks down on peaceable protesters. I mean, in Turkey, of course, we also have these attacks by ISIS, and we also have attacks by the state, different kinds of attacks. Maybe, and I think I very much doubt they are in concert, but we have different ways that public assemblies right now are at risk of being attacked or either violently or violently incarcerated. But the idea that the violent crackdown is a way of trying to control a population at the same time that violence continues to display the unpredictability of its consequences. In other words, it can't succeed in controlling in quite the way that it imagines that it will, although sometimes it does a pretty good job. Anyway, I appreciated that maybe there's a spectacle of state violence that is there as a warning or as a threat that is meant to subordinate and control.
Thank you so much. I know.
Do you want to say anything in response?
I would love to, but I think I will say it over dinner.
Okay. All right.
And let everyone.
All right. Thank you very
get
much.
Some dinner
Thank
too.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.